Welcome back to the Monday, January 22nd, 2018 meeting of the Dennis-Yarmouth Regional School Committee. Our first order of business will be to welcome State Senator Julian Cyr. Following that, we will have our citizens' question and comment period. Can we please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Well, we're honored to have State Senator Julian Cyr here tonight. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. He's going to give us a little update of things happening on the Hill and educational-wise. So welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Chairman Tierney, and to members of the school committee. It's great to be with you here this morning. Actually, the last time I was in this building was last spring to see the Reading Recovery Program that's run out of the Station Ave School. Truly remarkable program and one that receives significant state support, and we're hoping to continue to support that. So I'm just past the 1 year mark in my first term as state senator for the Cape and Islands district. This is Mashpee. The district is all Mashpee all the way out to Provincetown, and then Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. And one of the things I felt really important is that in my job, so many of the laws and things that we do on Beacon Hill and in state government are implemented right here in our local schools by our school committees in our towns, and so many of the things that you folks want to do for the education for the students and the young people of Dennis and Yarmouth ends up going through state government or Beacon Hill in some way. And so that relationship, I think, is very critically important. And a big part of my job is just being an advocate for the region. So in my first year, went around to visit with all the select boards in my district, and now have kicked off making sure that I'm going to the school committees. Was in Barnstable 2 weeks ago. I'll be at Monomoy later this week, and we'll visit up with several others. This isn't my sort of first time dealing with school committee deliberations. Actually, when I was in Dennis's shoes, I served as a student representative to the Nauset School Committee. So, Dennis, be careful. You might end up in my position if you're not careful. So just want to basically give you an update of some of the things that we've been working on, and then have a conversation. Certainly it was a pleasure to join the whole DY community in December to celebrate the DY football team's statewide win, and Dr. Coach Funk on the championship. I had so much joy in teasing my colleague from Westfield, who was defeated by you folks, and your athletic program and many of your programs, just really continue to be just outstanding. The volleyball program, the girls volleyball, the girls cross country, being first in All-Stars on the Cape in 2017. That's quite a feat. And I've also been following the progress underway through the MSBA process, looking at the Mattakese Middle School. I know that facility well. I did I was very involved in music programs when I was coming through middle school and high school, and so definitely spent time at Mattakese. And when I was there, which is in the 2000s, early 2000s, it seemed like it could use an update. So glad to see you folks are proceeding with that. My office and the whole Cape delegation will be with you to support you on that process. I work really closely with and have a great partnership with Representative Tim Whalen and Representative Will Crocker, who represent Dennis and Yarmouth in the House. And so we'll be with you on that. It is a process, however we can assist. I want to just talk about a few of the things that we're looking at in the state legislature as it relates to education. I think that given the current moment in education politics in the Commonwealth, and in part I think because of the outcome of the 2016 ballot referendum, charter schools are sort of a freeze on major education policy on Beacon Hill. We've done some things. We passed a bill around English language learners, which I hope is going to give a lot more flexibility to you folks at the school level. But I think increasingly the consensus for around supportive schools, school funding, is that we're going to have a hard time if we try to redistribute the pie, but the way that we can get more resources to everyone is by expanding the pie. And so one of the ways we've done that is through the Foundation Budget Review Commission, and I'll walk through some of the proposals and some of the pieces we're trying to push. In the Senate, this is led by Sonia Chang-Diaz, who's the chairwoman of the Education Committee. We'd really like to get something done in the Senate and really commit ourselves to the Foundation Budget Review Commission and to those recommendations. What's coming later in 2018, and will be on the 2018 ballot most likely, is what's called the Fair Share Amendment. This is a proposal to tax millionaires and billionaires at a higher rate to have them pay their fair share. It'll generate over 1.5, maybe upwards of $2 billion. And that the thought is, and I think the commitment in the legislature is that these are dollars that we're going to use to expand that pie for education funding. Now, why I'm a big proponent of the Foundation Budget Review Commission and implementing those recommendations is if we would pass that legislation, it would actually commit the legislature to using some of these new dollars for education. We tend to we tend to sometimes be cagey or not necessarily always follow through on the promises that are sort of made there. I've only just gotten there, but I'm certainly aware of that. And so I think anything we can do to sort of tie fair share amendment to supporting education, I think would be dollars well spent, and something I think would go a long way. So more to be seen there. The Foundation Budget Review Commission, out of 2015, and this is prior to my tenure in the legislature, but I followed this and worked to get up to speed on it, looks at 6 areas where we need to increase our support to schools across the Commonwealth. One of those is around health insurance costs. This is something that, if you folks were just in an executive committee, I suspect, talking about your budget, probably the largest driver in your budget is healthcare costs. Along with maybe personnel and a few other pieces. This is something that we'd like to look to align as much as we can healthcare costs with what the average GIC rates are. The second is around special education, and that pushing to change the assumed in-district SPED cost, which right now is assumed at 15% of students, to an assumed 16% of students. We think this will make a difference. I'm actually currently going into our FY19 budget process, pushing that we expand the special education circuit breaker from 65% to 75%. So for DY, that would mean a difference of $130,000. So you folks get around $882,000 at the 65%. That goes up to over $1 million at 75%. I've signed a letter to the chairs of Ways and Means asking that they do this in the budget. So special education is really important. Looking at resources specifically for English language learners, which I know I've talked to Superintendent Woodbury about here. This is something that Dennis-Yarmouth has in recent years sort of had an increased need for. There's not, we currently would look to add English language learners at an increment to the sort of base per pupil rate. Also make sure that we're including it in vocational schools. There's the Foundation Budget Review Commission also lays out that we need to look at low income and really broad in how we're looking at low income. This would be helpful for our community and our communities because the sort of old way, the sort of traditional way of doing things is a snapshot looking at property values, and that, of course, puts us at a major disadvantage. And then also looking at data collection and inflation as other topics. So these are recommendations. I think there is. We would say that in the Senate, this proposal has some legs. I think there's a desire to have us commit to some of that. Unsure if that can get through the House as well. But I do think that given what will be on the ballot in 2018, I think we should be prepared that going into early 2019, there will be sort of a renewed conversation about what do we do if the ballot initiative goes through, if it brings in the amount of money we think it does. I think as a region, as the Cape, I'd like to see us be prepared, looking at one, who else is sort of in a similar boat as us in the state, and really how do we make the argument, what are we going to make the argument for our needs are here. So certainly we'll work with Superintendent Woodbury and others to get feedback on that. Would like to have maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 meetings in advance of 2019 to get us to just be prepared for this, because I think once it moves, it may move quickly, and I think that as as folks do know down here, we are outnumbered in many ways. So I think the more organized we can be, the more prepared we can be. The other area where we've been spending some significant time looking at policy in the Senate is healthcare cost containment. Healthcare costs are, whether it's for your school district's budget, whether it's for a family's, a household's income in their budget, healthcare costs just continue to be a significant driver, significant increase. Even in the state budget, 43% of the state budget now goes to mass health. That's growing. If you include other health and human services, it's 50%. That actually means less money for everything else, including education. So the Senate passed a pretty comprehensive cost control measure in November. Was able to participate. There's some good things on the Cape for this. The expansion of telemedicine, which will be helpful out here, especially for behavioral health services. We struggle to get psychotherapists. We struggle to get specialists. Also an expansion of what our paramedics can do and what they're able to bill for. And then a whole host of very wonky, complicated policies as it relates to cost containment and price variation across the healthcare system. But I think for us, the telemedicine piece and the EMT, the paramedic component will be good. The House is going to take something up this spring. Likely it'll be more specific. I'm hoping that the priorities that are important to us regionally remain in that process. So that's sort of the sort of what's on the agenda from what's on the sort of education agenda on Beacon Hill this session. So I think keep your eye really to what happens in late 2018, in November 2018, and if the Fair Share Amendment passes, which I think we expect it will, it polls somewhere about like 75% or 80% to voters currently. I mean, now anything's possible in politics, so don't count on it, but I think we should be prepared for that. The other pieces that I wanted to talk about just briefly tonight is that the GIC, the Group Insurance Commission, will be holding a public hearing in Hyannis on Friday, January 26th. This is something that Representative Peake and I are co-sponsoring. If there's interest in the committee, we're glad to sort of distribute that. The GIC has put forward some pretty unexpected and controversial consolidation of offerings. This likely will impact retirees of the DY system, and so that they should think about chiming in about this. Essentially, it goes from 6 health plans to 3 that are offered in the main program. You'll be hearing a lot about this, I think, in the coming days, but wanted to make you aware of that. And then, wanted to also mention, and something that my predecessor had worked on and sort of periodically we always talk about in the region, is looking at early education and how to expand early education and universal pre-K. I think this is something where I'd like to see the state do more. I think we can do more. When I talked to, actually today we had we have a task force in the Senate that's working on retail issues, and the major concern of business owners and businesses here on the Cape is workforce. And part of that challenge is around childcare. I'm beginning to see this with my cohort, who now is, folks are having babies and children, and how do you kind of make that all work? There was an effort that was started at Mashpee and Wellfleet. It sputtered out a little bit. I think, however, I can assist in that. I think our communities would be well served by really looking at how you'd be able to do this. Certainly not something that's going to happen overnight, but however I can support that. And then the final piece I just wanted to talk about is looking at some public health information that I've recently come across. And just as a point of information, my background is I spent 6 years at the Department of Public Health in Massachusetts prior to assuming this position and being elected to this position. So I tend to be kind of a data guy when it comes to public health information. And we've certainly been spending a lot of time talking about the toll that the opiate epidemic, heroin, prescription drugs are having on our community. And so Barnstable County Health and Human Services did this really, I think, really interesting and important look back, looking at death data from 2004 to 2014, saying, all right, what can we learn about and figure out? What are the common threads between the several hundred individuals who have died of opiate overdose here on Cape Cod? What can we tell any common threads about these people? And some really interesting information. So 281 deaths were attributed to death by opioid poisoning from 2004 to 2014. This is this 10-year period. And the data showed several things. People who have a high school diploma or less are disproportionately represented in that death picture. Persons who are working in trade and service industries are also disproportionately represented, and that there's a likely interaction, I think, as we know, around occupational injury, opioid prescription, and self-medication. But what's just pretty remarkable is that of that 281 number, 69% of those individuals are people who had a high school education or less, meaning that they're what we would call straight to work. So these are folks, if they're growing up here on the Cape, they're coming through our school system, they're graduating high school, maybe they're not graduating high school, but they're not going on to get a college degree, they're not going off Cape, they're not even going necessarily to community college, but they're straight to work. And I think that 69% number, almost 70%, is just very, very eye-popping and very stark. That's compared to, if you look at the whole population of Barnstable County, 31% of the population of Barnstable County has a high school education or less. So certainly that really stands out. And then looking at sort of what industries are involved, 65% of all the decedents are employed in trades or service industries, and 1 in 4 and a quarter are employed in construction. And so I think that, to me, from a public health perspective, really shows when we're looking at risk in our community, and especially looking at risk among our young people, the young people who are most likely to, from this data, most likely to die of an opiate overdose are individuals who are going straight to work and likely in service and trades. And I think that this is really powerful information, and I think important information to take a look at and wanted to share with you folks in looking at how do we tailor interventions in our schools, and also more broadly our community, but for better or worse, the place that we have connection with these young folks is in our schools. And how do we tailor interventions, and prevention work, how the state can support some of that, how we could look to further support any of these efforts in our upcoming budget process from the state. So that was just the last piece I wanted to mention because I felt it was so, from an epidemiological perspective, those are really kind of big, eye-popping numbers, and it really shows, very clearly, the data just goes to 2014. Death data can be very tough to, it takes several years for that data to be processed and scrubbed, but I think it's clear enough and it's significant enough that I think I wanted to raise it. I'm raising it before all the school committees. So those are just some of the topics I want to address. Glad to answer any questions. Certainly want to hear priorities that you folks have and work that we can be doing as a delegation. Certainly, I think the MSBA process, and as that continues, we'll certainly look forward to working on that. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
No, thank you. Do you guys have any questions for Julian? Phil, go ahead.
I was particularly impressed with the report from the state editor, Suzanne Bump, about the funding process for regional schools, and it really provides good background and good data of why regional school districts have a little bit more of a difficulty getting consistent and fair funding than single-town school districts. And she had a nice historical perspective, but also some suggestions. And that report, while it doesn't have the mandate to make it into action, should be a good adjunct to making policy decisions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Morris. It's a terrific report. I'm a member of the Regional Schools Caucus, as is, I think, certainly Representative Whalen and Representative Peake, where we've really tried to focus is on the kind of helping to fill the gap on the regional school transportation, which the gap is almost always there. So we'll take a second look at that report. If there's any specific recommendations that you would think would make most a difference in DY, let us know, because I think I'd want to focus on that. Certainly care about regional schools across Massachusetts, but particularly the 3 that I have in my district.
I would be glad to pass my opinion on to what.
And I suspect you won't be shy about passing it. Thank you, Mr. Morris.
Andrea?
Thank you so much for coming here tonight. That was great. And I thank you for having that musical background because, Dennis, you see, there's more you have in common, see? So Dennis is an astounding musician, and he's very creative. So, but I like the fact that you were in the healthcare too, because that opioid epidemic is very important to us, and those statistics give you a lot of information, but there's more within there that I think we have to look at. And there's a couple of things that I was interested in always, is that we do more for our citizens around health preventative issues prior to getting to need that. And I think that we should have more workshops, not only for kids and parents, adults. We have a huge senior population. We have to look at all those things and have a health fairs so that they can get themselves checked, rudimentary, blood pressure and all that. But what are you going to do to keep yourself healthy? And I would love to see more of that for everybody across the Cape. As far as the circuit breakers go with special education, I've found, I don't know how everyone else agrees, but I'm going to talk about myself here, that the biggest problem is not the special education, but it's those people who need more than we are able to give them. And we want to give everybody everything they need. That's not the problem. But sometimes the need is so great that it is very challenging, and I would like to see some initiative around that. That to me is very, very, very important. I love the early childhood initiative. I think that would help so many parents. Right now we have a lot of working poor. People have 2 and 3 jobs. McDonald's, manager, Dunkin' Donuts, they're here, they're there, they're everywhere. And they have young children. They're in the reproductive age stage coming to our area to help us because we're a service industry. We need to really help them. That would be a great betterment for our parents. The Fair Share initiative to expand the pie. We do have a lot of wealthy people who have big houses on the Cape. And I think that we've looked at how we do that and how we go about it. But this is an area that lots of people buy homes here, second homes. This may be their third home, whatever. We have to look at how we're going to do that. And instead of, I have a problem with that. The idea, somebody has to really work that out. My idea would be if we could have here on the Cape an initiative. Everybody buys those scratch tickets. Cape Cod has one of the highest amount of people that buy them. If we could have scratch tickets here just for education, it would be phenomenal. I mean, if people are going to buy the scratch tickets anyway, why can't we just feed the people on the Cape that really need it? We're almost an island community, and our needs are very different from the rest of the people in Massachusetts. And I think that's all I have. But thank you very much for coming here and sharing that information. And those are very sad statistics about the opioid deaths. Very sad. Thank you.
My pleasure. On the health topic, actually, I've been one of the lead champions of a program, actually a fund that was created several years ago by the legislature called the Prevention and Wellness Trust Fund, which really gets at providing our current sort of sick care insurance-based healthcare system just doesn't, it's focused on acute care. It's often not focused on preventative care. What the Prevention and Wellness Trust Fund does is actually channels dollars to the community to actually work on those preventative measures that we know save a whole host, improve lives, save healthcare costs. There's been a pretty successful effort funded by the Prevention and Wellness Trust Fund on the Upper Cape, looking at hypertension, diabetes, falls prevention. Great results. Trying to get the Prevention and Wellness Trust renewed and expand the funding so we could bring a program like that here to Dennis-Yarmouth and elsewhere across the Cape. I think on early education and childcare, when we talk about how profoundly unaffordable our community has become, the cost of childcare is yet another stress on working families. And I think that, especially given all that our working families are up against just to eke out a living here and to afford living here, and I think if you look at where we're going from an enrollment perspective, the more we can retain people, I think is important. And certainly, the delegation has been spending a lot of time looking at how do we fund another major problem that doesn't necessarily relate to education, but it's a pretty big regional-wide problem, which is wastewater, and we're looking at some of the pieces that you kind of outlined there. So I appreciate those comments. Thank you.
Jim?
I know it's not you didn't create the problem, but the regional transportation is a real disaster. And the state really should be ashamed of the way they reimburse the communities. They encourage regional transportation, they encourage regional school systems, and yet they've done a pitiful job reimbursing us. That's one thing. Secondly, I think that there's an awful lot of money that goes into the state coffers, and yet a district like us, we get like 16% of our cost from the state. I think that's a barn roll, quite frankly. So I realize you didn't create the situation. It's been a situation that's been around quite a while. But hopefully you can take it back to your compatriots and at least tell them people are concerned on the Cape.
Certainly, I think that disaster is a good way to look at regional school transportation funding. I think that, and I would agree. I think it's hard for schools that I represent really kind of aren't sort of getting their fair share. The challenge that we have is, the Cape is represented there's only 8 of us in the legislature out of 200. And so it becomes a bit of a numbers game. I think the piece that is really important is coalition building, right? And so working with, I kind of fondly call my colleagues who also serve sort of hinterland regions, right? The hinterland caucus, right? Those of us who are sort of further from Boston, and so how we can work to sort of team up and collaborate, I think helps towards that. But I really do realize the tough situation. Specifically, I think Dennis-Yarmouth, more than any other school district here on the Cape, has gotten the short shrift from state formulas and from that funding. Certainly just came into it. I'm hopeful that there's more that we can do, and that as we expand the pie, that maybe we can work to rectify some of this. So I certainly appreciate and agree with your comments.
Anybody else? Julian, thank you very much for coming out. We're definitely very well representative in our district between you and Tim and everybody. I think you guys are doing a great job up on the Hill. Trying, I know you're only one vote, and a small contingency on the Cape. So I thank you, very much. Just to piggyback on the transportation funding issue, they say that, they're going to reimburse 100% of the transportation costs back. We only get a small piece of that pie. At the bottom of that says subject to appropriation. If I told a parent that we could pick their student up subject to appropriation, I don't think we'd be here right now. So I think that's something that needs to be discussed. The fact that if they're going to say they're going to get it back to us, we need to rely on that. So that's something big. As far as the opioid, epidemic, thank you for those numbers. I think that's a great report, and that's something that I think our district, with our police departments and everything, we're working pretty hard to try to rally that in, because it's those high school students that are just graduating or just still in school that are that 69%. So thank you for those numbers. I think it's great. So I appreciate you taking the time to come out, and it's great to see a representative come out and say hi and update us. So
Of course, thank
Don't be
you,
a stranger.
Chairman.
We'll be.
I think on the opiate issue, and specifically in looking at interventions that you're working on, both with public safety and educators and school administration, as well as healthcare providers. If there are initiatives or barriers you're running into, the legislature, Governor Baker's filed a sort of an opioid 2.0 bill. That's sort of a starter, a marker in the conversation. There's a whole host of proposals that we're going to be looking at and we're going to be taking up. I'm actually really keen to look at how do you expand the services that paramedics can provide. So currently, when you have an intervention, especially around an overdose, it's sort of the only option is to go to the emergency department. That sometimes isn't always warranted. So we're looking at that. But I think especially on initiatives either within the school or collaboratively, however we can help on that. Certainly money is always a piece of that, but sometimes you actually run into legal barriers, because I think increasingly, if you look at how this epidemic is manifesting, we have seen overdose rates decline Commonwealth-wide. That's not what's happening here on Cape Cod. Those numbers have stayed steady. If anything, they've increased. The emergence of fentanyl and carfentanil and these other synthetics are making are really kind of making it even more challenging. But anything you folks encounter, and especially to the superintendent and to your staff, please let us know, because we'll be taking that up in the coming months. And I'm not an educator. I'm not in the schools. I don't have kind of that pulse there, but would really love to champion anything that would make not only your lives a little easier, but I think really enhance intervention and prevention work. And I really do appreciate the work that DY has done around the social behavioral learning, the emotional learning. I think this is really important work that we know from an evidence-based perspective really makes a difference. So however I can support that, please let me know.
Carol, go ahead.
All right, you wanted me to put in my 2 cents, I can tell. Actually, I do want to thank you and all of our legislative contingent on the Cape, because I know you guys work really well together across the aisle. Probably the best model we can see, right?
We do. It's quite refreshing in this
yes.
current political climate.
Yes. Need we say more? So I want to thank you. The circuit breaker thing will certainly be a big help. Anything you can do with transportation, certainly we're always looking at the health insurance pieces as well. But being mindful that when you guys set aside a pot of money for either transportation or circuit breaker, depending on who else is in the pot with us, it determines how much we really get. So whether it goes really truly from 65 to 75, sometimes those things happen and sometimes they don't. I know you're aware of that. But another thing that you might not be thinking about, I know it's affected some of our cities, is the difference between the economically disadvantaged statistic and the real free and reduced lunch. I don't have the calculation with me here tonight. I didn't come prepared for that, but I could certainly give it to you. But it's the difference between, in a lot of cities, very, very significant amounts of money, but for us as well, because we have a lot of people who don't get food stamps or who don't join the welfare rolls or who don't do those sorts of things, which I think we should really celebrate when people don't take assistance. But they're not afraid to ask for free and reduced lunch for their kids. And so the difference for us is between, say, 35% economically disadvantaged and 57%, most of which are free lunch. It's a 23% differential. And when you put it across all the places where those numbers are used, we're at a significant disadvantage. We might not be Revere, we might not be Chelsea, but it's pretty significant for us, and I did do the math at one point, which I don't have in my head. As far as the whole idea about the opioid piece, I think, although I heard you also say that some of the trade industries, because of course physical labor, people sometimes get hurt, they get the prescription from the doctor and then it leads them down the wrong path, which is something that's separate from people who don't have a high school diploma. I think certainly we've worked very, very hard in our district to make sure that all of our kids graduate. But one of the things, they have to not just graduate, they either have to graduate and go on to further education, which many of our kids can't afford, or they have to have the means to get a living wage job. And some of the things that are happening right now, not our tech schools can't take all of our kids. And we've given up on having in our comprehensive academic high schools some things that could help kids get some living wage jobs. I think some more money or grants or something to help us to put a few of these sorts of programs in. Ken and I have been meeting with a group of people across the Cape for, at least 2 years now, talking about this idea of a recovery high school. Now, we're not necessarily think that we need like a building that says, hey, recovery high school, but we need to be able to have some money to create some programs for kids who really want to opt into something like that. And sometimes, anybody who's in recovery, whether it's alcohol recovery or other kinds of recovery, they sometimes need to get away from the environment that is keeping them in that cycle. And so it can't necessarily be a program in the basement of your school, but maybe it could be down the street so that at least in the day-to-day you're not there. A way we could save money is to send, perhaps, if it was close, some of our very best teachers to still give them their awesome academics that they're going to need to be successful citizens. But yet we could create some other things in there, like alternate peer group activities and things like that, so they have fun things to do as well as some skills. People need skills in order to get a job. And if we could have a skills-based type program, I think it would go a long way. And there's no shortage of ideas on our committee. We just don't have the time right now we actually almost wrote a bar foundation, but we don't have time with everything else that we're doing. So we need some assistance in that, and I think we could make some significant progress. And I guess my last question is, how realistic do you think the governor's budget will be when we see it over the next few days?
So just to your last question, the governor's budget is sort of an opening proposal. The legislature, under the Constitution, sort of has power of the purse, and I think we take that very seriously. The piece that is really real in that, right, is that the House, the Senate, and the governor all agreed to revenue consensus. So the bottom line of that budget has to be kind of broadly in line. I think there may be new revenue sources in play that are not in the governor's budget that will be in the House or Senate budget. Expansion of short-term room occupancy, I think, is one the Senate did last year. It didn't come out of conference. So broadly, the confines in the governor's budget, are on. I think usually when it comes to education funding, when I've looked at this, the House or the Senate tries to do more than the governor's budget. So the governor's budget is sort of
So we could use that as our base.
I think using that as your base, with of course some
Would
caution,
be safe.
will be safe. Yeah,
Thank you.
and it's based on that revenue revenue projection. I haven't.
I appreciate that.
There's a real desire to do more for schools. Certainly not as much as I think. I would like to see us do what we did for local aid expansion several years ago in education. I don't know if we're there. I think to your comment, we don't have time. I mean, that's the story of so much of our social policy, right? Is that we don't do really meaningful as a society and as a Commonwealth. We really don't do meaningful poverty alleviation, family development, beyond the confines of our schools. And so just like increasingly, it's how do we ask teachers and educators and administrators to do more, because that's the only space that we've got. And I think broadly that's highly problematic and just
Somebody who could have written a grant would have been a help.
Right. And I think when you have opportunities on that, this is where I think we can be helpful as a delegation, maybe just in connecting with someone who has that time, who may have that time and that expertise and that resource. I think with the opioid, with that data, there definitely is, and we can share that. And actually, if you're really interested, I'd encourage you to invite the Barnstable County Health and Human Services folks to come and present it, because they can really get into the weeds of the crosstabs, and there's actually a lot of intersection between, between that 69% and the 1 in 4. But I think living wage jobs is a huge challenge, especially for folks who, aren't able to afford or don't have the options. That students who go on to college, either in the community college or off Cape do. And it's a huge challenge for us, and something I think we're trying to work on. But given how profoundly unaffordable our communities have become, largely driven by housing, is that it's just harder and harder for all of us to make ends meet, but especially for younger folks who want to make a life here, and we need them here in our community. We need young people to stay on Cape Cod and to be invested in this place. I mean, if you look at where things are going, so certainly an issue I care a lot about, and we're working on. It's just not going to happen overnight, but certainly appreciate your comments.
Great.
Thank you for everything.
Just something really quick, Andrea?
Just have one, I wanted to say this before, preventative. Here on Cape Cod, all of us that have kids here or were brought up here know how difficult it is in the winter months. There's nothing. You can go to the mall, you can go to the movies, you can go out to have dinner, but that's it. We need something for our young people. We need something for the place for them to go, someplace meaningful. And I would like to just see some more initiative put in that area, because, we can talk about opioids and we can talk about drugs and we can talk about depression and suicide and everything. But if we don't do anything for them, and we know how it is, we have a party, we wave goodbye to everybody on Labor Day, but then it just quiets down. There's nothing. We need Boys and Girls Clubs or something like that for not only young kids, but young adults too.
Yeah, I think, and it's across the region I represent. I mean, being here in Yarmouth tonight, it feels like a metropolis compared to, Truro in my neck of the woods. But I think you're really right. It was interesting, the Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister actually appointed a Minister of Loneliness, which I think is really interesting concept. And I think primarily it was geared around older adults, but it's also for young people as well, and really looking at, I think, how do we provide meaningful activity, outlets, human connection for people. More and more, this isn't just nice to have stuff, it's actually really essential for success and well-being and health and survival. So your comments are appreciated. We've got more work to do there for sure, but it is a challenge. Having grown up out here, I can appreciate that very much.
Julian, thank you very much for coming out and spending some time with us. It's much appreciated.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to come back, and certainly, we work very closely with the superintendent, but however we can be a resource. And again, looking forward to working with you on the MSBA process. Hopefully we can be successful there.
Thank you.
Thank you.